May 1989. A city that breathes history through every cobblestone alley, where the voices of students fill colonial plazas and university halls with life. This is Guanajuato, a jewel of the Mexican Bajío, the cradle of national independence and a refuge for artists. It is here that every year thousands of young people arrive with academic dreams and the promise of a brilliant future. For many, the University of Guanajuato, with its emblematic staircases and architecture that has witnessed centuries of knowledge, represents the very symbol of educational hope in Mexico. But on May 2nd, 1989, that hope was about to curdle into the darkest nightmare the university town had ever known. What began as a typical Tuesday morning, with students preparing for what seemed to be a routine academic field trip, would become one of the most disturbing cases of enforced disappearance in Mexico's modern history. 23 young people between the ages of 19 and 24 left the university campus that morning, their backpacks filled with notebooks, cameras, and the characteristic energy of those who believe they can change the world. None of them would ever return. For 35 years, the families of these students lived with an official story that never made sense. That the youths had willingly run away, that they had decided to abandon their lives, their families, their studies, everything, without a trace. But in February of 2024, an accidental discovery in the government's classified archives would change everything. A file stamped "Do Not Process," forgotten in the back of a government warehouse, contained the truth that the Mexican state had buried along with those 23 young souls. Among the documents was a dirt-stained notebook, its pages filled with handwritten entries detailing every step of what truly happened on that fateful day. This is the real story of the 23 students who vanished, and what the state never wanted to be told. Before we continue with this story, one that is sure to leave a profound impact, we invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other vital cases like this one. And let us know in the comments where you are watching from, because we know that stories of this nature resonate deeply across the world. Among the 23 missing students, each had a story, a family, and dreams they could never fulfill. María Elena Rodriguez Soto, 21, was in her third year of Hispanic literature. Her classmates remembered her as a young woman passionate about the poetry of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, always carrying a blue cloth-bound notebook where she penned her own verses. On the day she disappeared, María Elena was wearing her signature denim jacket, decorated with patches of Spanish-language rock bands and pins with slogans of social protest. In her backpack, alongside her textbooks, was a letter she had written to her mother but never had the chance to send. The letter, recovered years later among her found belongings, read, "Mama, when I finish university, I want to be the voice for those who cannot speak. I want my words to do more than just adorn pages." Carlos Alberto Mendoza Fierro, known to his friends as Beto, as Biscuits, Zapatiti, was 22 and in his final semester of civil engineering. He was the eldest of 5 siblings and the first in his family to attend college. His father, a bricklayer by trade, had worked overtime for years to pay for his studies. Beto always said that his first project as an engineer would be to build a proper home for his parents. That May 2nd, he wore the university's soccer team jersey where he played as a center back, the number 4 printed on the back. In his backpack, besides his scientific calculator and rolled-up blueprints, he kept a Kodak film camera with which he documented every outing with his friends. The roll of film he had that day had 24 exposures. He had used 23. The last photo taken that morning showed the group smiling in front of the main university building. Ana Lucía Herrera Domínguez, 20, was a second-year psychology student. She was known for her student activism and her participation in the university council. Small in stature but a giant in presence, Ana Lucia organized reading circles on critical pedagogy and human rights. That day, she wore her characteristic white t-shirt with the phrase, "Knowledge cannot be silenced," written in black marker, a garment that would become a symbol of the search in the years to follow. Her best friend, who couldn't attend the trip due to illness, would later recall that Ana Lucia had left her a ticket for a Silvio Rodriguez concert scheduled for the following weekend at the Teatro Juarez. "Save me a seat," were her last words before she boarded the bus. Roberto Jimenez Valdez, 23, was about to graduate with a degree in history. The son of rural school teachers, Roberto had grown up among books and discussions of social justice. His professors described him as a brilliant student with a prodigious memory for historical dates and events, but above all, with a unique ability to connect the past to the present. In his olive green canvas backpack, inherited from his veteran grandfather, he always carried three things: an etymological dictionary, a hardcover notebook where he jotted down historical reflections, and a photograph of his girlfriend, a medical student who was on duty at the university hospital that day. Roberto had promised to call her as soon as they returned from the trip. That call never came. These four young people represented the diversity of the group, students from different majors and socioeconomic backgrounds, united by their youth, their desire to learn, and their commitment to a better Mexico. The remaining 19 had stories just as moving. Alejandra, who was the first woman from her village to study law. Miguel, who worked afternoons to pay for his economics degree. Sofia, a brilliant chemistry student who dreamed of developing affordable medicines. Juan Pablo from communications, who ran the student magazine. Each one left a void impossible to fill, an absence that for 35 years tortured their families with the uncertainty of not knowing what truly happened. Tuesday, May 2nd, 1989 dawned with a clear sky, uncommon for that time of year in Guanajuato. The temperature hovered around 22 degrees Celsius at 7 a.m., with a light breeze that promised a perfect day for outdoor activities. The students had arranged to meet at 9:30 a.m. in the main esplanade of the university, in front of the iconic staircases. The activity was officially registered as an interdisciplinary field study, a joint project between several faculties to study the socio-economic development of rural communities near Irapuato. At 9:45 a.m., with a 15-minute delay typical of the university atmosphere, the group began to gather. Several witnesses who did not participate in the excursion would later recall specific details. María Elena arrived running, her black hair flowing, apologizing for being late. Beto carried a small cooler with sodas they had all chipped in for. Ana Lucia was distributing photocopies with the day's route and the objectives of the study. Roberto was meticulously checking that everyone had their student ID. At 10:15 a.m., Professor Jorge Santillan, who was supposedly coordinating the activity, appeared briefly to give some final instructions. This detail would become crucial years later, as Santillan would vehemently deny having been present that morning. However, at least 7 students who did not go on the trip clearly saw him giving instructions to the group. He told them that the university bus had a last-minute mechanical problem, so they had arranged for alternative transportation that would pick them up at the side exit of the campus on Cantaranas Street. 10:30 a.m. marks the exact moment of their departure, documented by a photograph taken by an architecture student from the second floor of the central building. In the image, blurry but identifiable, the group of 23 students is seen walking towards the side exit, their silhouettes outlined against the mid-morning sun. It is the last known image of the entire group alive. At 11 o'clock a.m., according to the later testimony of a woman selling traditional sweets on the outskirts of Guanajuato, She saw a white, unmarked bus pass by, filled with young people who looked like university students. Some of them were waving from the windows, seemingly in high spirits. The woman specifically remembered seeing a young woman in a denim jacket with patches, a detail that matches the description of María Elena. 12:30 p.m. An employee at a Pemex gas station at kilometer 15 of the Guanajuato-Irapuato highway would report weeks later having seen the white bus stop to refuel. He recalled several young people getting out to buy snacks and drinks at the convenience store. One of them, who from the description could be Carlos Alberto, asked about alternative routes to reach the community of San José de los Llanos, their supposed destination according to the original plan. 1:45 p.m. represents the last confirmed contact with the outside world. Ana Lucía managed to make a call from a public telephone in what witnesses would later describe as a small village before San José de los Llanos. She spoke with her roommate Laura Espinosa for about 3 minutes. According to Laura, Ana Lucía sounded normal, perhaps a little rushed. She told her they had stopped for a quick bite to eat and would reach their destination in about half an hour. She mentioned the landscape was beautiful and that she was taking a lot of pictures. She also commented, and this detail would be crucial, that they had seen several state police patrols on the road. More than usual, but she didn't think much of it at the time. "See you tonight," were her last recorded words. The window of time between 12 o'clock p.m. and 3:30 p.m. is when the unthinkable occurred. Independent investigators who would try to reconstruct the route years later discovered that the bus never reached San José de los Llanos. The inhabitants of that community, interviewed repeatedly over the years, were consistent. No group of university students arrived that day, that month, or that year. A chilling detail would emerge years later. At 2:47 p.m., the local radio station in Irapuato briefly interrupted its regular broadcast. Several listeners reported hearing what sounded like screams and agitated voices for about 20 seconds before the signal returned to normal. The station attributed the incident to technical interference, but could never satisfactorily explain the origin of those voices. 3:30 p.m. Two farm workers laboring in fields near State Highway 110, approximately 8 kilometers from San José de los Llanos, would report seeing an unusual convoy. 3 black suburban-type vehicles with no visible license plates escorting a white bus. The convoy was heading down a dirt track that led to an area known locally as El Mogote, a desolate and hard-to-reach area. One of the workers, Don Aurelio Marquez, 67 at the time, remarked to his companion, "Those folks aren't from around here. We'd better head the other way." His intuition may have saved their lives. By 5 o'clock p.m., the parents of several students began to worry. The original plan indicated the group would return to the university around 4 o'clock p.m. The first calls to the university were met with evasive answers. They were probably delayed. The traffic was heavy. There was nothing to worry about. By 7 o'clock p.m., concern had turned to alarm. A group of parents appeared at the university president's office demanding information. It was then that the contradictions began. Professor Santillan denied having authorized any field study that day. The administration had no record of any university bus being assigned for that date. There was no official documentation of the supposed interdisciplinary activity. The fragment of a map that would be discovered years later, tucked inside the inner pocket of a buried backpack, showed the route they followed that day with unsettling precision. An X marked in red ink pointed to an exact spot on State Highway 110, just where the road makes a sharp curve and is hidden by a natural rock formation. Next to the X, a barely legible note, meeting point, 14:30. The handwriting did not belong to any of the missing students. The official response to the disappearance of the 23 students was a masterful exercise in denial, obstruction, and cover-up that began in the very first hours and would extend for decades. At 9 p.m. on May 2nd, when the desperate parents went to the Guanajuato Municipal Police Headquarters to report the disappearance, they were met with the first bureaucratic wall. A formal missing persons report could not be filed until 72 hours had passed. "The kids probably just went off to a party," was the response from the commander on duty, Ricardo Herrera Montiel, who would later be identified as one of the officials involved in the cover-up. On May 3rd, while the families organized their own search parties, the Guanajuato State Attorney General's office issued its first official statement, a document that would set the tone for the entire subsequent investigation. There is no formal record of any academic activity scheduled for May 2nd, 1989, involving the departure of students from the University of Guanajuato. University authorities have confirmed that no institutional transport was authorized for said date. On May 4th, the official case file 089 PGJ 1989 recorded a finding that would become infamous among the families. Following preliminary inquiries, this Attorney General's office determines that there are no elements to suggest the commission of a crime. The absence of the aforementioned youths corresponds with high probability to a voluntary decision to temporarily withdraw from their academic and family activities. This conclusion was reached without conducting a single real search, without interviewing the witnesses who saw the group that morning, and without tracing the route they supposedly followed. The university students were quick to react. On May 5th, more than 1,000 students marched from the campus to the government palace, demanding concrete action to find their classmates. The response was immediate and brutal. Riot police dispersed the demonstration with tear gas and batons. 27 students were arrested on charges of disturbing the public order and defamation of authority. The message was clear. Anyone who questioned the official version would face consequences. On May 7th, the first brave witnesses began to come forward. Rosa Maria Gutierrez and Pedro Sanchez were both vendors, running stools on the road to Irapuato. They stepped forward, speaking to local media, to declare they had witnessed the group of students being detained by what appeared to be official vehicles, though they bore no clear markings. "It was about 3 in the afternoon, Rosa Maria stated, looking into the cameras of TV Guanajuato. "I saw them stop the white bus the kids were on. There were several black trucks, and the men who got out wore dark uniforms. They looked like federal agents or something. The boys got off the bus with their hands in the air." The authorities' reaction was immediate. That very night, both witnesses received visits from investigators who interrogated them for hours. The next day, Rosa Maria and Pedro publicly retracted their statements. They claimed they had been confused, that they had probably seen a different bus on a different day with different people. Shortly thereafter, Rosa Maria vanished from Guanajuato. Pedro closed his business and moved away, leaving no forwarding address. On May 10th, Mother's Day in Mexico, the mothers of the disappeared students held their first silent protest in front of the government palace. Dressed in black, clutching photographs of their children, they stood for 12 hours under the scorching sun. The image was so powerful that several national media outlets began to take an interest in the case. It was then that the state's machinery revealed its capacity for media control. On May 11th, the state governor, Rafael Corrales Ayala, held a press conference. He presented what he called conclusive evidence that the students had planned their own disappearance. He displayed letters, allegedly found in some of the students' dorm rooms, where they spoke of starting a new life, tired of academic pressure. The families immediately denounced the letters as crude forgeries. The handwriting didn't match. They used expressions their children would never use. and they mentioned places their children had never visited. But by then, the official narrative was already cemented in the government-controlled media. The preliminary forensic report dated May 15, 1989, is a document that defies all investigative logic. Without a single body, without any physical evidence, the state's medical examiner, Dr. Joaquin Mendoza Rivas, concluded, "There are no indications of violence or criminal activity in the disappearance of the aforementioned students. The available evidence suggests a voluntary absence without signs of external coercion." Years later, it would be discovered that Dr. Mendoza had received a significant promotion and a house in an exclusive area of León, Guanajuato, just 2 months after signing that report. On May 20th, 18 days after the disappearance, the case was officially closed, classified as disappearance by voluntary departure. No further investigation was deemed necessary. The case file, a mere 47 pages, contained more contradictions than evidence. Testimonies that didn't align with the dates, photographs of places that didn't match the described route, and statements from officials that contradicted one another. It was clear the document had been hastily assembled with the sole purpose of closing the case as quickly as possible. A particularly disturbing element of the cover-up was the handling of the students' belongings. On May 25th, some backpacks and personal items mysteriously appeared in a municipal landfill on the outskirts of Irapuato. The authorities claimed this confirmed their theory. The students had abandoned their possessions to start a new life. However, the state of the objects told a different story. The backpacks were torn with stains that looked like blood. The books were partially burned. The student ID cards had been deliberately destroyed. When the families requested forensic tests on these items, they were informed that the objects had been accidentally incinerated as part of the landfill's waste management protocol. What do you think really happened to the students? Why did the authorities deny everything from the very beginning? What powerful interests were behind this massive cover-up? Leave your theory in the comments as we move forward through the decades of silence that followed. And if this case is impacting you as much as it is me, give it a like so that more people can learn this truth, hidden for 35 years. The years that followed the disappearance of the 23 students became a prolonged torture for their families, an exercise in resistance against institutionalized forgetting and social indifference. Every May 2nd, without fail, the families would gather on the steps of the University of Guanajuato for a candlelight vigil. In the beginning, hundreds of students and citizens joined them. As time passed, the numbers dwindled until only the core group remained. The mothers, a few fathers, siblings who had grown up without ever knowing their older brothers and sisters, and fiancés who never married, waiting for a return that seemed increasingly impossible. 1990 marked the first anniversary, and with it the first organized attempt to keep the memory alive. The Committee of the Families of the 23 was formed, led by Doña Carmen Soto, María Elena's mother. Doña Carmen, a woman who had aged a decade in 12 months, became the movement's tireless voice. "My daughter did not leave of her own free will," she would repeat to any microphone that would listen. "They took my daughter, and I will not rest until I know who and why." In 1992, an event offered the families a fleeting glimmer of hope. A deserter from the state judicial police, protecting his identity under the pseudonym The Witness, contacted the committee through an independent journalist. He claimed to have information about what he called Operation University Cleanup, a secret operation to eliminate student cells considered subversive. According to his testimony, the 23 students had been mistakenly identified as part of a non-existent guerrilla group. Before he could provide concrete proof, the witness was found dead in a hotel in Querétaro, an apparent suicide. The note he left behind simply said, "Forgive me, I can't go on." His handwriting, curiously, could not be verified, as no prior samples of his writing existed. 1995 brought an accidental revelation that the authorities quickly silenced. The local newspaper, El Observador de Guanajuato, published a brief, almost unnoticed note on page 7. It stated that during the construction of a new highway near Celaya, workers had found unidentified skeletal remains in what appeared to be a mass grave. The note mentioned the remains corresponded to approximately 20 young individuals and had been transferred to the forensic service for analysis. The very next day, the newspaper published a retraction, claiming the information had been erroneous and that the remains were from livestock. The reporter who wrote the original story, Andrés Villegas, was fired and never worked in journalism again. In 1998, the case took an unexpected turn when the newly created State Human Rights Commission decided to review the file. The commissioner, Patricia Duran, was known for her integrity and courage. For 6 months, her team interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed documents, and requested information from various government agencies. Her preliminary report, leaked to the press before its official release, pointed to serious irregularities in the investigation and evidence of possible involvement by state security forces. 3 days before the official presentation of the report, Commissioner Duran was in a car accident. It happened on a straight, empty road in perfect weather. She survived, but with severe amnesia that left her unable to recall any detail of her investigation. The final report, published by her successor, concluded there was no evidence of human rights violations. The new millennium brought no justice, but it did bring new ways to keep the memory alive. In 2001, the younger siblings of some of the disappeared, now university students themselves, created the collective 23 Voices. Using nascent social media and internet forums, they began to document and share information about the case. They created a website where they compiled photographs, testimonies, documents, any piece of information that could help reconstruct the truth. 2002 was the year of the most promising anonymous tip. An international NGO dedicated to forced disappearance cases, Justice Without Borders, received an envelope with no return address. Inside were precise geographical coordinates and a note. Look 3 meters deep. Not all of them, but some are there. The coordinates pointed to a location in the municipality of Romita, Guanajuato, in a desolate area known as Los Terreros. The NGO pressured the authorities to conduct an excavation. After months of bureaucratic delays, it was finally authorized. Excavators worked for 3 days, watched by the families who had traveled there, hoping for answers at last. They found nothing. Years later, it would be revealed that the authorities had deliberately dug 500 meters west of the provided coordinates. In 2005, Doña Carmen Soto, the tireless leader of the Families Committee, died of a massive heart attack during the annual vigil on May 2nd. Her last words, according to witnesses, were, "María Elena, my daughter, I'm coming." Her death marked a turning point. Some relatives, exhausted by years of fruitless struggle, began to resign themselves to their loss. Others, inspired by Doña Carmen's example, redoubled their efforts. 2008 brought a technological development that renewed hope. A group of systems engineering students at the University of Guanajuato developed facial recognition software that could digitally age photographs. They took the pictures of the 23 students and created projections of what they might look like 20 years later. The images were distributed massively online, with the hope that someone somewhere might recognize one of them if by some miracle they were still alive. Thousands of tips came in. None led to anything concrete. In 2010, an independent investigator, retired criminologist Ernesto Pacheco, published a book titled The 23 of Guanajuato, Anatomy of a Cover-Up. In its pages, Pacheco connected the case to two similar ones: the disappearance of 17 students in Puebla in 1987 and 19 in Oaxaca in 1990. He suggested a pattern, a systematic policy of eliminating potentially troublesome student leaders. The book was pulled from shelves 2 weeks after its publication under the threat of defamation lawsuits. Pacheco received so many threats that he had to go into exile in Canada, where he died in 2015. With a broken heart, his family said, for having failed to bring justice. 2012, a federal election year, brought renewed promises. The new governor of Guanajuato pledged in his inaugural address to review all unresolved disappearance cases in the state. A special prosecutor's office for disappeared persons was created. The families of the 23 were the first to present their case. After 6 months of exhaustive review, the prosecutor's office concluded that there was no new evidence to justify reopening the investigation. The pattern repeated itself once more. In 2015, the case gained international attention when the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights included the 23 of Guanajuato in its report on forced disappearances in Mexico. The Mexican government responded with the same old script. There was no evidence of state involvement. The investigation had been conducted properly. The case remained open should new information arise. The same lies, with slightly different words. 2018 marked the 29th anniversary. By then, many of the parents had passed away without answers. The younger siblings, now adults with their own families, carried the inherited trauma. Some had named their children after their disappeared siblings, a desperate attempt to keep their names alive. The annual vigil had shrunk to fewer than 50 people, but their determination remained unbroken. February 9th, 2024 began as an ordinary day at the General Archive of the state of Guanajuato. Miguel Ángel Torres, a 34-year-old archivist with just 2 years on the job, had been assigned the tedious task of digitizing old documents from Basement 3, the oldest and most neglected section of the archive. Among the employees, Basement 3 was known as the Crypt, a damp, poorly lit space where documents no one had consulted in decades were stored. Miguel was working methodically box by box when he found an anomaly. On shelf 47B, nestled between boxes correctly labeled with dates from 1988 and 1990, was an unlabeled metal box sealed with industrial tape that had yellowed with time. What caught his attention was the red wax seal on the lock, bearing the official crest of the state of Guanajuato, and above all, a small, nearly illegible tag that read, "Do not process, Level 5 authorization required." Curiosity overcame protocol. Miguel checked that he was alone in the basement, took photographs of the box from every angle to document its original state, and carefully broke the seal. The contents left him breathless. 3 manila folders marked classified, Operation University 89, 7 black and white photographs of clearly identifiable young faces, and a sealed envelope addressed to Commander Alejandro Ruiz Monterrey. Authorized eyes only. He examined the photographs first. They were ID-style headshots, but in a different format from the university's. On each photo, besides the student's face, was handwritten information. Full name, date of birth, major, and most disturbingly, a classification. Primary target and secondary target, or acceptable collateral damage. Miguel immediately recognized some of the faces from the "Have You Seen" posters he had seen for years on the streets of Guanajuato. The first folder contained what appeared to be a detailed operational plan. The document, dated April 28, 1989, 4 days before the disappearance, described with military precision the neutralization of subversive elements within the Guanajuato University environment. It listed the names of the 23 students, their daily routines, their personal relationships, their political activities, real or imagined, and a risk assessment for each one. María Elena Rodriguez Soto was classified as high-risk propagandist. Carlos Alberto Mendoza Fierro, medium risk, influence by association. Ana Lucía Herrera Dominguez, critical risk, proven leadership. The second folder was even more revealing. It contained communications between different levels of government, from the municipal police to what appeared to be federal agencies. The memorandum, dated April 30th, 1989, and signed by the State Secretary of Government, was chillingly direct. It instructed, proceed with Protocol 7, ensure plausible deniability. Coordination with media confirmed. Another document, an operational order for 600 hours on May 2nd, detailed the plan. Interception at designated point 1430 Arecibo, 3 support units. Transfer to Black Site 4, process according to attached instructions. But it was the contents of the third folder that made Miguel's blood run cold. They were post-operative photographs, images that should never have existed. They showed the students handcuffed with clear signs of abuse inside what looked like a warehouse or an aircraft hangar. A sequence of photos documented what appeared to be an interrogation in progress. The final photograph in the series, dated May 2nd, 1989, 23:47 hours, showed only a pile of clothing, burning inside a metal drum. The letter addressed to Commander Ruiz Monterrey was the most damning document of all. Handwritten and signed by someone identified only as Eagle 1, it read, Alejandro, operation completed as per parameters. The 23 packages were processed without public incident. Media coverage secured, families under surveillance. Level 2, recommend maintaining pressure on potential witnesses, final disposal site. Coordinates attached. The coordinates had been blacked out with a marker, but under direct light they were still partially legible. Secondary site cleanup scheduled for 15:05. Proceed with disinformation protocol as agreed. Destroy this communication after reading. At the bottom of the letter, a note in different handwriting. File for insurance. Do not destroy direct order JHHS. Tucked among the documents, Miguel found something that disturbed him on a visceral level. A small notebook, the kind police officers use for field notes. It was stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Its pages held detailed, hurried notes of the entire operation, as if the author were documenting events in real time. One entry read, 1542, resistance on the bus, had to use more force than authorized. The girl with the pin badge, Ana Lucía, won't stop screaming about rights. The engineering student, Carlos Alberto, tried to negotiate. Ridiculous. Another entry, 1930. The interrogation isn't working. These kids don't know anything about any cell. I think intelligence was wrong. Eagle 1 says it doesn't matter anymore, that we proceed with Plan B. The last page of the notebook held a single line written in a trembling hand. God forgive us. They were just children. Miguel spent the next 3 hours photographing every document, every page, every photograph with his personal phone. He knew he was violating every protocol, likely breaking several laws, but he also knew he held in his hands the truth that 35 years of lies had buried. When he finished, he placed everything back in the box, but he didn't seal it. Instead, he moved it to a different section of the archive, nestled among civil construction records from 1975, where it would be less likely to be found if anyone realized it had been discovered. The leak of the documents found by Miguel Ángel Torres detonated a media firestorm the government could not contain. On February 15, 2024, 6 days after the discovery, the first images appeared on the independent news portal. Guanajuato uncensored. Within hours, social media erupted. The Guanajuato 23 became a global trending topic. The photographs of classified documents, operational orders, the images of the detained students. It all circulated uncontrollably across the internet. The government's initial response was predictable: deny the document's authenticity. At an urgent press conference on the morning of February 16th, the Guanajuato Secretary of Government declared them to be elaborate forgeries, designed to destabilize the nation's institutions. But the social and media pressure was overwhelming. National and international human rights organizations demanded an immediate investigation. On February 20th, facing untenable pressure, the Attorney General's office announced the creation of a special investigation commission, composed of independent forensic experts, representatives from civil organizations, and international observers from the UN. Dr. Patricia Mendoza Chen, a renowned forensic anthropologist with experience in forced disappearance cases in Argentina and Guatemala, was appointed as the technical coordinator of the investigation. The first step was to verify the document's authenticity. Using ink dating techniques, paper analysis, and comparative graphology, the forensic team confirmed what many already suspected: the documents were genuine, created in 1989. Analysis of the photographs using facial recognition software confirmed the faces belonged to the missing students. Furthermore, metadata recovered from the original negatives, later found in the same archive, confirmed the exact dates and times the photos were taken. Simultaneously, the investigation team began working on the partially visible coordinates from Eagle One's letter. Using multispectral imaging technology, they managed to recover the complete numbers. The coordinates pointed to a location in the municipality of Silao, specifically to an abandoned ranch known as La Esperanza, the Hope. Ironically, it was less than 2 kilometers from where skeletal remains, which authorities in 1995 had dismissed as belonging to livestock, had been found. On March 1, 2024, the excavation began. The process was broadcast live by multiple media outlets, with the families of the disappeared present, many of them now elderly, supported by their children and grandchildren. At 11:47 a.m., the shout of a forensic archaeologist shattered the tense silence. They had found human skeletal remains. Over the next 15 days, the forensic team worked meticulously. They recovered remains corresponding to at least 17 individuals. The arrangement of the bodies suggested a hurried burial. Some were in a fetal position, others laid out, all at different depths, as if they had been thrown in at different times. Among the remains, they found personal effects: shirt buttons, belt buckles, a wristwatch stopped at 4:23, and, heartbreakingly, a pendant of St. Jude Thaddeus that Roberto Jimenez's mother immediately recognized as the one she had given her son the day before he disappeared. DNA analysis began at once. By March 15th, 6 of the students had been positively identified: María Elena Rodríguez Soto, Carlos Alberto Mendoza Fierro, Roberto Jiménez Valdés, Patricia Luna Cervantes, Miguel Ángel Reyes Durán, and Alejandra Sánchez Morales. Each identification was announced in a private ceremony with the families, scenes of intermingled grief and relief that broke the hearts of everyone present. But the investigation didn't stop at finding remains. The legal team began tracking down those responsible, the names mentioned in the documents. Commander Alejandro Ruiz Monterrey had died in 2007, apparently of natural causes, though his death now seemed suspiciously convenient. However, other names in the documents belonged to people who were still alive. On March 20th, in a coordinated operation, 4 former officials were arrested. Ricardo Herrera Montiel, the former municipal police commander who had rejected the initial missing persons report. Jorge Santillan, the professor who had denied his involvement. Joaquin Mendoza Rivas, the medical examiner who had signed the fraudulent report, And, surprisingly, Juan Hernández Silva, who in 1989 was the Undersecretary of Government, and now, at 78 years old, was living in a quiet retirement in an exclusive residential area of León. The testimonies began to flow. In exchange for reduced sentences, some lower-ranking ex-policemen began to talk. José Luis Martínez, a 23-year-old rookie officer in 1989, offered the most detailed and devastating account. He described how they had received direct orders to intercept the bus, how the students were separated into groups based on their level of dangerousness, how they were interrogated for hours about supposed connections to guerrilla groups that never existed. When it became clear they knew nothing, that it had all been an intelligence mistake, it was already too late. Martinez declared before the commission, tears streaming down his face. The bosses said we couldn't let them go, that they knew too much, that they had seen our faces. The order came from above, from way up high. They told us it was for national security, that these students were a threat to the state. We were young, we were scared, we obeyed. Not a day has gone by in 35 years that I don't regret it. The most shocking testimony came from an unexpected source. On March 25th, María del Carmen Gutiérrez, a secretary in the governor's office in 1989, came forward voluntarily. She had kept silent for 35 years, but seeing the elderly mothers still searching for their children had broken her. She presented evidence she had kept secret, copies of communications between the state and federal governments, audio recordings of conversations discussing Operation University, and most damning of all, a handwritten list from the governor himself, naming problematic students at various universities across the country. On March 12, 2024, the federal government issued a historic statement that shook the foundations of the Mexican state. After an exhaustive investigation, we recognized the existence of the operation designated Operation University 89, and we deeply regret its tragic consequences. The Mexican state assumes its responsibility in the forced disappearance of the 23 students from the University of Guanajuato. But the official acknowledgement was just the beginning. The investigation had uncovered an even more terrifying truth. The Guanajuato 23 were not an isolated case. The documents made reference to similar operations in other states. The connection that criminologist Ernesto Pacheco had suggested in 2010 was real. There had been a systematic pattern of eliminating student leaders, perceived as threats during the period from 1987 to 1991. Juan Hernández Silva, the detained former undersecretary, decided to cooperate fully in exchange for house arrest due to his age and health. His testimony, recorded over more than 20 hours, revealed the full architecture of the plan. It was the final era of the Cold War, he began. There was paranoia at the highest levels of government about communist infiltration in the universities. A parallel unofficial intelligence group was created, answering directly to a committee of federal and state officials. It was called the Academic Security Committee, but internally we knew them as Los Halcones, the Falcons. According to Silva, the committee had identified student cells in several universities that they considered high risk. Most were just politicized student groups organizing debates, reading circles, peaceful protests for better educational conditions. They weren't guerrillas, they weren't terrorists, Silva admitted. They were idealistic young people who questioned the system. But in those days, questioning was the same as subversion. Operation University 89 had been planned for months. The 23 students from Guanajuato had been selected based on reports from infiltrators within the university. Mostly other students who received payments or academic benefits in exchange for information. Ana Lucía Herrera was marked as a priority target after organizing a protest against a tuition hike. María Elena Rodriguez had drawn attention for poems published in the student magazine. that criticized government corruption. Carlos Alberto Mendoza wasn't even politically active, but his close friendship with student leaders had put him on the list. The most harrowing testimony came from a former agent identified only as Protected Witness 7, who had participated directly in the operation. He described in chilling detail the students' final hours. After the interception, they were taken to a warehouse on the outskirts of Silao. The original plan was to interrogate them and release them with threats to keep them quiet. But the interrogations got out of control. Some of the agents, especially those brought in from Mexico City, were veterans of the dirty war of the 70s. They used methods that should never have been used on civilians, much less students. The witness described how Ana Lucía Herrera had maintained her dignity to the end, reciting articles of the Constitution while being interrogated, refusing to name other students even under torture. María Elena had tried to negotiate, offering to take sole responsibility if they released the others. Carlos Alberto had tried to protect the female students, taking additional blows for his bravery. Roberto had maintained a stoic calm, memorizing faces and names as if he knew that one day someone would tell his story. The order to eliminate them came near midnight, Protected Witness 7 continued. They said it had been a mistake, that these students weren't the right targets, but that they couldn't be released. They knew too much. They had seen too much. Commander Ruiz Monterrey took a call. He just said understood and hung up. Then he ordered us to proceed with the final protocol. The students were executed in 3 groups during the early morning of May 3rd. Their bodies were initially buried at the Silao site, but later documents revealed that some were moved weeks later when rumors about the location began to surface. This explained why the remains of only 17 students had been found. The other 6 had been moved to a secondary site that had yet to be located. The investigation also revealed the extent of the cover-up. It hadn't been mere negligence or incompetence. It had been an active, continuous operation of concealment. For 35 years, a small group within the government had maintained surveillance on the families, infiltrated search organizations, sabotaged investigations, and silenced witnesses. The budget for maintaining the cover-up, according to financial documents found, had exceeded 50 million pesos over the decades. A particularly disturbing discovery was what they called the mirror archive, duplicates of all the case documentation kept as insurance against potential regime changes or exposure attempts. This archive included audio recordings of the torture sessions, photographs even more graphic than those initially found, and, most chillingly, recordings of each student's final words. By unanimous decision of the commission and the families, these recordings would not be made public, but their existence was confirmed. The VHS tape labeled Salida Campo 89, Field Trip 89, mentioned in the visual breadcrumbs of the original investigation, was finally located in the home of one of the detained perpetrators. Though partially damaged by time, forensic technicians managed to recover fragments of the recording. It showed the students being forced into official vehicles, their faces shifting from confusion to fear, to absolute terror, as they realized this was no ordinary arrest. The link to the cases in Puebla in 1987 and Oaxaca in 1990 was confirmed. The same names appeared in the documents, the same modus operandi, the same orders to cover it all up. In total, it was estimated that at least 59 students had fallen victim to these operations over a 4-year period. Each case had been meticulously concealed. Families were intimidated or bribed, witnesses were silenced, and the official history was rewritten. What you are about to discover about the final chapter of this case is more disturbing than you can imagine. The justice that arrived after 35 years carries a bittersweet taste. one that forever marks the families and Mexican society itself. If you think you can handle it, keep watching. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already, because cases like this must never be forgotten. On April 3, 2024, 35 years and 1 day after the student's execution, the criminal proceedings against the surviving perpetrators began. The trial, broadcast live by order of the Supreme Court of Justice, became the most watched in Mexico's judicial history. Juan Hernández Silva, Ricardo Herrera Montiel, Jorge Santillán, and Joaquín Mendoza Rivas faced charges of forced disappearance, aggravated homicide, abuse of authority, and crimes against humanity. The families, many now represented by children and grandchildren as the original parents had passed away, filled the courtroom. Doña Esperanza Fierro, 89 years old, the mother of Carlos Alberto, had survived to see this day. In a wheelchair, on supplemental oxygen, but with a firm gaze, she testified before the court. "I am not seeking revenge," she said. "I am too old for hatred. I only want the truth to be known, for the names of my son and his friends to be cleared, for the world to know they were not criminals. They were good boys who only wanted a better country." On April 15th, the federal government organized a public apology ceremony at the Juarez Theater in Guanajuato. The President of the Republic, standing before the families, survivors, and citizens, offered a historic apology. "On behalf of the Mexican state," he declared, "I ask for forgiveness for the unforgivable crime committed against 23 innocent young people. I ask for forgiveness for 35 years of lies, of cover-ups, of re-victimizing the families. This is not just a crime of the past. Every day the lie was maintained, the state was once again an accomplice." On May 2nd, 2024, the 35th anniversary of the disappearance, the memorial of the 23 was inaugurated in front of the University of Guanajuato. It is not just a plaque or a statue. It is a space of living memory. 23 columns of pink stone, each bearing the name, photograph, and a brief biography of a student. In the center, an eternal flame and an inscription: "Truth is slow, but it arrives. Justice is delayed, but not denied." Here we remember those the state tried to erase. Their voices, silenced in 1989, resonate eternally in every student who fights for a just Mexico. The memorial includes an underground museum displaying the students' recovered belongings, copies of declassified documents, and video testimonies from survivors and family members. Admission is free and a visit is mandatory for all new students at the University of Guanajuato, so that every generation knows the history and understands the price of academic freedom and critical thought. On July 10th, 2024, the Law of the 23 was announced, a constitutional reform that classifies forced disappearance as a crime with no statute of limitations, establishes immediate search protocols, and creates a university alert system to protect students in high-risk situations. The law also mandates the creation of a permanent truth commission to investigate other similar cases from the period between 1960 and 2000. The trials concluded on August 23, 2024. Juan Hernández Silva was sentenced to 30 years in prison, to be served under house arrest due to his age. Ricardo Herrera Montiel and Jorge Santillán each received 40-year sentences. Joaquín Mendoza Rivas, 25 years. Additionally, they were permanently banned from holding public office, stripped of all government pensions and benefits, and ordered to pay reparations to the families. But perhaps the most emotional moment came on September 1st, 2024. The remains of 4 of the 6 missing students were located at a second site in Romita, Guanajuato, thanks to new information provided by a dying former agent who wished to clear his conscience. Ana Lucia Herrera Dominguez was finally identified among them. Her T-shirt, bearing the phrase "Knowledge cannot be silenced," though deteriorated, was still recognizable. She was buried in it, fulfilling her younger sister's wish. The final reflection on this case can be none other than to acknowledge that justice came too late for many. Parents who died never knowing what happened to their children. Siblings who grew up with an impossible void to fill. Lovers who never married, waiting for a return that would never come. But it is also a story of persistence, of the refusal to forget, of the power of truth even when it takes decades to emerge. The case of the Guanajuato 23 did not end the day they disappeared or even the day they were found. It continues every time a student raises their voice, every time a family refuses to accept official lies, every time someone chooses to remember instead of forget. Their voices, buried for 35 years under tons of lies and earth, were heard again. And this time the echo will be eternal. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has touched you deeply, just as it touched me while researching and narrating it. These are not just numbers or cold cases. They are lives cut short, families torn apart, a society scarred by impunity. Subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss the next case. We need to keep these stories alive because the moment we forget them, we allow them to happen again. Comment with a case you'd like me to investigate next. Do you know of an unsolved case in your country that deserves to be told? Let me know in the comments. Every Latin American country has its own Guanajuato 23, waiting to be uncovered, waiting for justice. Like this video if you want more stories like this, not for the thrill, but for the need for truth and justice. Share this video with someone who appreciates well-researched true crime, but above all, with someone who values the importance of historical memory. And remember, somewhere, in a forgotten file, in a dusty basement, lies the truth about a case that the authorities said never happened. Sometimes all it takes is one person, a brave archivist, a committed journalist, a family member who refuses to give up, to open that box marked "Do Not Process." I'll see you in the next case. Until then, never forget, the truth always finds a way to the light.